This is the quiz review for quiz one of the second quarter. As always, there'll be at least there will be two little tidbits of insights that you will get by watching this video or listening to this audio that you might otherwise not have heard. It isn't that I hadn't said them, but I'm going to emphasize them particularly now. Okay? So let's start. First off, you have to make sure that you know what it means when Jesus says it is finished on the cross. Thank Max for that. Also, know what type of sin one may or may not receive the Eucharist, a state of mortal sin or a state of venial sin. Thank Lauren for that. And what was instituted at the Last Supper? Two things in particular were instituted at the Last Supper. Annie and Gabriella are on that. By the way, I'm sure there were others that probably had some of these questions in one variation or another. I gave a shout out to the ones, that I hit first. So, love yous all, though. All right, also, how long does the presence of Christ remain in the Eucharist? That was very specific. Think in terms of substance and accidents, please. And we call the presence of Christ in the Eucharist real. But what is that in relation to other types of presence? Christ is present in the priest, present in all of us, and also present in the word spoken. So make sure you know that. And you ought to know what transubstantiation is. Understand if there's any variations on that definition or talks in terms of symbolism that doesn't relate to a change of substance. Make sure you're aware that those would be insufficient understandings of the term. Let's see. I should know something about each of the four cups, particularly the third and fourth cup. Those will probably be the two most important. So just kind of know the few things that go on about each of those. All right. Here's a little insight. The Catholic Church, I already told you, stands or falls on the doctrine of the Eucharist. That's how important it is. And primarily because it's God's act of sanctifying the world through Christ and in Christ. So make sure you're on top of that. Also, as far as transubstantiation, you should know what type of change we are talking about. You can thank Shay for that one. Let's see. Let's talk about typology. The Ark of the Covenant in the Old Testament represents what in the New Testament? Thanks, Catherine, for that. And as far as bitter herbs being associated with one of the cups, which cups were they associated with? And make sure, says Lancia and Daniel, that you know the Eucharist is the sacrament of what? Remember, baptism, faith. So that, in that line of thinking. Here's another insight. The Eucharist as source and summit encompasses which of the followings? Well, you should know, first of all, that it contains properly the whole Christ. And it is the spiritual good of the entire church. Okay, so make sure you know that. Bread, I said, what is the natural signs of bread? Well, you should know what those two things are. And also, the four cups of Passover are expressions of a deliverance of what? If that shows up in a multiple response, you should be able to lay those out. You should also know the material cause of the Eucharist. And you should also know what Jesus meant when he said on the cross, it is finished. Now, you should know the difference between accidents and substance. You should be able to identify any of the implications for accepting the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Thank you, Garrett. You should know what Melchizedek was referring to as far as an archetype. Thank Emily for that. Also know about being in communion in order to receive. Okay, thank Thomas for that. You should also know that, let's forget about transubstantiation. What is simply the understanding that we need to have as Catholics for the Eucharist? Body, blood. Thank you, Madison. And also, just what is it called when a person in the Old Testament or an event prefigures an event or person in the New Testament? Thank you, Edward. And Jesus and the disciples, they left the Last Supper, Passover meal, after which cup? Thank you, Anya. What is the final end of the Eucharist as far as the four causes? What is the final end? Thank you, Madeline. And also, when they say during the Passover, next year in Jerusalem, what is that symbolic of? What do they mean by next year in Jerusalem? Thank you, Genesis. Now, here's something I thought was pretty good that Bevan threw out there. So this is going to show up in the quiz. I don't think it's going to show up as an extra credit. We'll see what happens. But I want you to connect these three things with three other things. First of all, Jesus did not drink the fourth cup at the Last Supper. Why? Jesus was praying for this cup to be taken away in the Garden of Gethsemane if it was God's will. What was he connecting, or what did he understand his own death then as? Let's say it that way. What would he understand his own death as? And then Jesus, moments prior to his death, said he was thirsting. What does that connect it with? So you're going to have those phrases, and you will connect those to three sentences that line up with those. If you want to hint where these are in your notes, they were at the end of the fourth cup lecture. So the last thing that I talked about were these things, and I think she did a good job grabbing them. That's it, guys. We might spend a little bit of time reviewing before the quiz as a class, but take down the questions from these, do well, study well, don't wait till activity period. God bless.